Okay, yeah, that's maybe a good idea. Yeah. So, Gonna, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Hi. Good morning to you.
Good morning to you as well. Good afternoon. Okay.
It's well, it's indeed already afternoon. Apparently. Okay, let me quickly switch to my screen. Jan was still very much in the heat of his presentation, as you've seen. And I'm going to try to switch here as well and make sure that we can see you somewhere. Many different screens.
Yeah, I think you will have to enable screen sharing and also video for me.
Yeah, there we go. So that should be done, and then you think you can already share?
Yes, I can.
Okay, perfect. Stop the video for a second.
I'm not able to come on video, it seems.
Okay. From the camera, you mean? Camera perspective.
Yeah. But I guess that's to my advantage since it's very early here still.
Should be feasible now.
Okay, let me see.
Still
not. No.
Okay, probably something limits on your side. Well, in any case, good morning. As I said, thanks for joining in. You're sitting on the other side of the Atlantic in Orlando, in Florida.
That's where Fortress is headquartered, but personally, I'm in New York City.
Okay. Well, that's also nice, of course. So we've had some short interactions, and thanks for taking the time in any case to share with us a little bit of your perspectives in terms of SBOMs for critical manufacturing. I know you've been having had some discussions with others in the manufacturing domain. We have some people here in the room also, basically as manufacturers, device producers, and so forth. So we're very keen to listen to basically your expertise and experiences that you would like to share with us.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me, and I'm looking forward to presenting to you with a bit of a US flavor as to what we are seeing here, and also look forward to any questions or discussion. And maybe I should briefly intro myself. So my name is Gonne Lambrink. I'm VP of Critical Manufacturing Security Solutions at Fortress Information Security. Fortress is a critical infrastructure supply chain risk management company, dominant with electric power asset owners in the US, with defense sector, and expanding in other critical infrastructure sectors, also adjacent sectors such as for energy, oil, and gas. I focus primarily on the OEM side of the supply chain equation, and also creating cascading effect, as every supplier is also a buyer. So there's always another supply chain to focus on. I came to Fortress after spending almost 9 years at Underwriters Laboratories, UL, focused there primarily on IoT security in various markets, so consumer, commercial, industrial, and started my embedded or product security focused journey in payment security initially. So that about me, and also about Fortress. And I can start. I think maybe confirm I have 45 minutes total, including questions, correct? Or maybe more like 30 minutes by now. I guess I guess I'll take 30 to 45. Thanks.
Yes, you can.
Yeah, awesome. So in terms of what I will cover in my presentation is spend quite some time or have some detail as to what the demand driver is for SBOM adoption in the US, and then briefly alluding to maybe what I'm aware of in the rest of the world, EU as well. Spend a bit of time as to what is the SBOM, and based on the prior presentation that I got the till end of, I don't think I have to go in depth or at length explaining what an SBOM is. I feel this audience is probably up to speed. And then talk a little bit about best practices as to what is considered best practice for generating SBOMs, sharing SBOMs, and talking about supply chain collaboration as well. And then close out with some takeaways. So in terms of SBOM demand drivers, it starts with before SBOM was a buzzword or an acronym. It started with increasing focus on software supply chain attacks, which we've seen many over the last years, and increasingly so as hackers continue to look for lower hanging fruit, and oftentimes supply chain partners are that low hanging fruit because of maybe having their guard slightly lower, less resources, etc. And specifically in the software supply chain, we've seen attacks since 2014. Basically, the Havix attack where Russian attackers took over or manipulated with malware web service or industrial OEMs, and thereby impacting their customer systems. We've seen major attacks such as NotPetya, Kaseya, and then since 2020, SolarWinds really brought this software supply chain attack debate to the forefront, with many public and private sectors stakeholders impacted, including, like in the US, more than 9 federal agencies. And then last year, around this time, the Log4j exploit, this tiny TD open source library that is omnipresent in in many IT and OT systems, which really brought to the forefront the needle in the haystack problem that you often have when you know a software component is vulnerable. You still don't know where you may be impacted because you don't know exactly where it sits. So Log4j is kind of the example use case where a SBOM would have helped tremendously, also as part of active incident response, to know more quickly where you're impacted. Right now, even a year after the exploit became known, many organizations are still struggling for both their own products and what they have sitting in their automation and IT environments to understand where exactly they still have to apply further mitigating controls. So if you were to have an SBOM and also an HBOM inventory, as these are already common for product management to keep track of, on the consumer side as well, if you are the end user of a product or a system, incident response will be enabled by having SBOM information, ongoing vulnerability management, much more rich vulnerability information, kind of developed bottom up with component level insights. So compared to network non-invasive scanning to have component level vulnerability insights, you'll get a lot more vulnerability insight than prior. And there's compliance use cases such as in the US, geopolitically motivated, like National Defense Authorization Act 889. There's certain banned entities for certain portions of US infrastructure. So making sure or understanding at a component level if any banned entities are present in products and systems, that's another use case. So both point in time and also ongoing risk management is where you will be able to leverage this information, including at the point of procurement. In terms of the discussion, headlines this year heavily dominated by this discussion, and SBOM as an acronym is kind of solidified, or people are very versed these days discussing SBOMs. At RSA in June, next to the bigger topic, Zero Trust, software supply chain was definitely being discussed, and including use of SBOMs. And in terms of federal government, lots of updates coming out of federal news websites regarding the federal procurement drive for SBOM adoption, and how federal agencies are moving fast, including the White House Office of Management and Budget. And then statistically as well, this remains on everyone's mind because of these software supply chain attacks increasing as much as threefold in the next few years. To put things into context, especially in my day-to-day job, supply chain risk management, of course, components insight doesn't stand on its own. There's a product management or product development DevOps use case. From a supply chain risk management use case, the component level insight is what you then tie to overall system and product risk, and again to overall vendor organizational risk as well. And even though you can't necessarily explain all of those risk areas with one simple score, if you are looking from the operator side, or whether you're procurement, compliance, risk management, asset management individual, you're trying to create some bridges between the different levels of risk. And that's what Fortress also specializes in, as we cover all of these risk areas with our supply chain risk management solution set. And for SBOM Insight, of course, a very obvious tie-in is to asset vulnerability management, whether it's IT or OT assets. So back to, or over to SBOM demand drivers in terms of what we are seeing in the US. The US took a heavily federal procurement focused adoption path to drive SBOMs after a lot of community effort, public-private community effort, led by primarily Alan Friedman, first over at Department of Commerce and NTIA, and now part of CISA under DHS. So what really mobilized this entire momentum for SBOM is the Cyber Executive Order of May 2021, Executive Order 14028, where federal agencies purchasing software are basically instructed to request SBOMs, or to have availability of SBOMs. Ever since, and especially over the last few months, or especially since September, the memo that came out of the Office of Management and Budget set out a real concrete path for a few agencies to have a set of further activities, and also for all of federal government, basically 6 months into June, until June 2023 or September 2023, to start asking for supplier attestations. And the focus is for supplier attestations on attestations that suppliers meet a secure software development framework, or SDL practices. And SBOMs are optional to request, and which is an artifact or showcasing that you are on top of your software inventory, at least, next to other attestations like VAX information. But rumor has it, of course, that if you are able to provide artifacts, that could potentially be a fast track, as opposed to saying, yes, I have SDL practices. An SBOM will be a more concrete data point or an actual artifact that could provide more reassurance to federal agencies that are looking for that. So in the memo, there's a few agencies that have special tasks, including the overall procurement arm of US government, so OMB and the General Services Administration, GSA. And then NIST has already put out a lot of technical guidance. They were instructed in the EO to basically define, first of all, for what software does the SBOM matter, provided a definition of critical software, and then came out with further SDL guidance, the Secure Software Development Framework, and supply chain guidance, especially through NIST Special Publication 800-161. And then CISA also has an important role, including, for example, helping to further define the supplier attestation format. And then what we are also seeing is vertical discussion or sector-specific discussion. As Fortress, we are very closely aligned with, among others, electric power. For electric power, a lot of guidance is put out by the North America Transmission Forum, which has most of the major electric power utilities in the US engaged, and also the supplier community. And they are in the earlier stages of developing an SBOM guide. What they have done for NERC CIP 13 compliance, for example, for vendor assessments, they were able to successfully standardize industry around a standard set of questions. So they are having a good success or track record, basically defining what electric power is ultimately going to be adopting. Because they also meet the NERC auditor guidelines. So that's a high level, and then I'm having a few more slides to kind of back up what I just said, because that was a lot of detail. So again, in summary, the EO issued in May of last year had a lot of work items for NIST that they by and large completed as of summer of this year. The emphasis was on supply chain, but also overall zero trust. And the OMB memo, there was a memo in March, but also in September, really sets out a very concrete plan as to what federal agencies are supposed to be doing in the next 6 to 9 months. So maybe kind of backing up a little bit on the NIST guidance. If you are not familiar, very easy to just Google NIST EO 14028. They have an entire resources page where you can find all of this guidance that they have developed. So in terms of critical software definition, that focus primarily on software where there's escalated or privileged access. Next to some other criteria, but basically focused in the end more on, if you have this type of system access, what other system access could be impacted. So really, when you think about it from a threat perspective, focused on the lateral movement, that if you have escalated access, what else can you be doing with that access? Then the secure development framework, which I already mentioned, which is really SDL focused guidance, and then overall supply chain guidance. So special publication 800-18 and special publication 800-161 kind of came into the forefront for NIST as part of their work for the executive order. And then slightly separate from the federal procurement discussion, but still related as part of overall software and IoT security, adjacent guidance, let's say, on consumer labeling and IoT, which I have a lot to say about personally, but it's a little bit removed from this discussion on SBOM, so I won't go into that for today. So with the NIST technical guidance, looking at the OMB memo, which is kind of setting the agenda for what agencies are going to be doing. What I mentioned already, what agencies must do is obtain attestations that suppliers meet the technical guidance by NIST, so primarily the SDL focused evidence. And then what they may ask for is, among others, further attestations like SBOMs that will have to meet the NTIA data formats, and they may also emphasize vulnerability disclosure program participation. And then looking at the timeline, so there's a few agencies that have further tasks like CISA and NIST, and then there's any and all agencies, of course, that may be impacted by this, and it depends a little bit on how they will go about with their own procurement organizations and further guidance. But this could, of course, have federal government-wide effects from DOE, DOD, etc. And basically, by summer of next year, they'll have to start operationalizing, getting attestations for critical software, and then right thereafter, getting attestations for all applicable software. So then in terms of the further guidance, by Q1 or February, CISA and OMB will work together to further define what that attestation form will look like. So ultimately what you as a supplier will be requested to provide. And then there's also talk about, for operationalizing this information sharing, there has to be some repository function. So the memo mentions a government-wide, like a central repository, to be put in place and fully operational ultimately in the next 3 years. And one can imagine that that would include those SDL type of attestation, but probably also the artifacts, so including also SBOMs. And in short, or when people speak fast, it gets abbreviated sometimes to the SBOM repository. Any questions so far, or any comments from the room?
Unmuting, looking around. No, you're good to go for the time being.
Okay. So I think here, based on the level of discussion that I just overheard, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time. I think most people, or based on the prior presentation at least, you probably are aware of what an SBOM is and also what it more or less contains. But basically it's an ingredient list, what's in the software, and NTIA has done work defining what minimal elements are. So they come up with 7 fields, and they're kind of self-explanatory. There's important reasons why some of these elements are prioritized, like the timestamp of the SBOM. Of course, it's a very dynamic piece of information, so kind of crucial to understand what version of software you're talking about, having a accurate timestamp. NTIA has really put out a lot of good guidance, so I included the links here, including the definition of what is an SBOM and an overview, and also this minimal elements for an SBOM. As part of public-private and industry discussion, they also published FAQs or SBOM facts and myths, addressing a lot of concerns like we can't share this type of information because it's proprietary, or this would offer a pathway to the attacker if they were to have this information. NTIA, especially in their facts and myths about an SBOM overview, they address a lot of those common concerns and questions. If you look at the different formats for SBOM, so there's 3 formats that have been somewhat standardized, including CycloneDX, SPDX, which also is a ISO standard, and then NIST's initial SWIT tags format. In terms of industry adoption, or what we at Fortress are focused on as well, as primarily supporting both CycloneDX and the SPDX formats. And then at Fortress, we recommend a few additional fields that are also partially covered by those 2 different formats, including product and component naming and types, next to a CPE identifier, also focused on Perl identifiers, a signature, and license information. And I actually, between the last and the next, I'm not so sure what the light blue and the dark blue is here. Anyhow, on the right hand side, in general, these are some additional fields that we feel SBOMs should contain to be more meaningful. Yeah, I had a few overview slides in terms of component identification. I think for this room, you probably are aware that that's not necessarily, or it's not straightforward always. There's in general a lack of naming of components, and then component naming is not always consistent, whether it's human error, spelling mistakes, or M&A and corporate changes. Very often it's not as simple as looking at the identifier for a component and then being able to look up vulnerabilities for that component, for example. For naming and naming convention, there's a lot of either identification that's lacking or naming that's inconsistent. So then you have nothing to really tie, for example, a component to vulnerability information for. Also, CPE naming or identification is primarily driven by CVEs. So for components that don't have any CVEs associated with them, or for organizations that are not actively participating in vulnerability disclosure or are not managing their MVD information, you may not have a CPE identifier. So for additional at a component level, we think having Perl identification information can help in addition, as there's richer identification information at a component level available than for CPEs. So looking or checking for both CPE and Perl identifiers ultimately gives you more coverage, or you will have more components identified as a result. So what does an SBOM example look like? So on the left side, you see what was kind of described in the different content fields prior, and then this is what it would look like. And ultimately, in the real life reality, almost no one will consume that. No human will look on the left side to see what's in the software. Once it's machine read and analyzed, what you'll probably be ending up with is more an overview like on the right hand side, which is an example Fortress analysis of SBOM information, where you basically have the risk analysis summarized. So for example, at Fortress, we focus on vulnerability, dependency, integrity, malware, and foreign affiliation risk. That's ultimately what most consumers will end up operationalizing in their risk management information versus the SBOM information straight. I covered this, so the different formats that are machine readable, yeah, each format has a few unique fields that may be relevant depending on use case. So what we also therefore advocate is not to try and, if you have an SPDX format, not to try and translate it into CycloneDX before analysis or the other way around. It's best practice to try and consume both formats for risk analysis, as otherwise you will be translating between the two, or trying to form a bridge between the two, or turning an SPDX into a CycloneDX or the other way around. You'll end up losing a few fields. So maybe from the SBOM definition into what are we now able to understand. So basically, the high level is we want to generate software transparency. It's a bit of a lemons market problem where an average developer knows more about the component, and then ultimately at a product level, the supplier knows more about their system and their product than an average end user or consumer does. This is the SBOM information is helping to kind of open up that black box. So in terms of a zero trust approach as well, what you end up now being able to do is, instead of taking for granted that the product may have a multitude of different software components, you can actually verify at a component level what different fourth party components are. you can understand the impact of legacy software, and also you become aware of more vulnerability information than prior. None of this is going to scale unless it's machine readable. And if machine read and analyzed at scale, what this will allow you again is to have a better insight at a component level, which will then allow you to respond to incidents faster, do better vulnerability management, etc. So primary use cases, and I think as part of this discussion, you're very much focused on the SDL product lifecycle, but there's also a level of maturity, or many IT, OT players, they do manage their software inventory, including also for license management, for example, is quite a mature use case. And then what is more a black box is on the end user side of the equation, where currently at least there's no mature practice, maybe other than for license management, but for general vulnerability management, there's no mature practice leveraging SBOMs. So there's a whole lot more to be done and gained on the consumer side of the house versus the producer. At least that's how we look at where industry maturity is at, and where there's still a little bit of a gap as well. So from use cases to what are some of the best practices? Today, arguably, there's a lot of focus on generating the SBOMs. We have had standardization effort in terms of what does an SBOM look like, what formats, what fields should it have. And there's been a lot of emphasis on tooling, that is open source or proprietary tooling to generate SBOMs. You can definitely use SCA tools, but not all SCA tools, especially if they're source code biased, may provide you with SBOMs if you don't have access to source. So there's a lot of new tools that emerged focused on firmware binary analysis. From SBOM creation to then SBOM sharing and consumption analysis and risk management. In a supply chain context, there's less maturity again on the right-hand side here. For sharing, such as through repositories, there is a need to allow for permission sharing and strong governance of that sharing, versus there are also suppliers that will put their SBOMs in publicly accessible places. But for a lot of this information sharing, it has to be controlled sharing. For analysis, to tie this to vulnerabilities, there's additional attestations, especially VAX information, that will help focus the vulnerability prioritization effort. And there's other broader supply chain risk analysis that needs to be enabled, likely not just looking at the SBOM component risk, but also what you know about the developer organization and individual contributor risk. And then it doesn't make a lot of sense to have as point in time analysis. So continuous monitoring is kind of what is needed and implied based on the nature of software, and software always changing, and vulnerabilities as well. And then in terms of actionable risk analysis, we'll see a lot more collaboration between vendors and end users. There's going to be not just an SBOM file, but also a email address and a contact number, or there has to be some human-to-human collaboration in the end to prioritize risk actions and track and trace that can be automated in with risk management software like Fortress's software as well. But there has to be some actual collaboration to then get to resolved findings. So in terms of the tooling on the generation side, and also in terms of looking at vulnerability risk, and let's say if you were to just look for CVEs, some of the traditional tooling for SCA analysis, software composition analysis, may not suffice. And that's among others because of a bias to source, although there's also binary SCA tools that exist in the traditional spaces like the AppSec space. But still there is a few shortcomings based on how that tooling was developed. And also noting that supply chain risk or context beyond just the components, also looking at the developer organization may matter, and those threats are not necessarily conveyed by a NVD CVE vulnerability. There's other types of risks that you could illuminate having access to SBOMs and broader supply chain risk management insight. So for SBOM generation, definitely the traditional tools, where I mentioned primarily bias to source and not necessarily covering all types of supply chain risk. There's vendors, of course, that can provide your attestations. If you are an end user or have access to binaries and firmware, you can reverse engineer, and that's how you can extract SBOMs from products. You can work with vendors so that you get the SBOMs from them. And ultimately, at the end of the day, you probably need all 4 mechanisms to get your SBOM information populated if you are an end user. Whereas with a trusted or trustworthy supplier and through some independent third-party vetting, like a company like Fortress helps with that, probably on the right-hand side, the collaborative security model is where you'll get the most accurate data. Reverse engineering success based on a variety of tool sets that you can use for that. We have done actually various empirical analysis experiments. You'll get to about a 60% success rate, both in terms of being able to generate an SBOM at all, and then also having a complete SBOM through reverse engineering. So even though it's an important function, because not all vendors will have an ability to collaborate and provide information. So you'll probably rely in supply chain risk management on reverse engineering. It's not the holy grail either. Attestations, of course, that's more a check in the box type of exercise in the end, depending on how specific the questions are, but you may have to see evidence, so there's a limit there. So in the end, probably you'll end up with attestations, reverse engineering, and vendor supplied SBOM information in combination. As for distribution, how is this information gonna flow? There's a variety of ways through which this information can be exposed. Ultimately, when you think from an asset owner operator perspective or an enterprise organization, there may not be a zillion ways that you would want to consume this information. So we personally think it's gonna, bias, or there's gonna be bias to having repository solutions as more scalable and also allowing for secure mechanisms for sharing, whether those are public or public-private or commercial or open source repository solutions, are probably a combination of all of those. But that allows ultimately for collaborative environments and secure sharing and a level of centralization that you don't necessarily get from other distribution mechanisms. So how you would operationalize a repository, this is very straightforward, but basically based on a definition of critical software, you would prioritize getting SBOMs associated with those systems and products, feed them into a repository where they get analyzed, and then the analysis, probably not the artifact itself, may end up being shared, permissions shared with the end user or the consumer. And risk analysis is probably going to focus on vulnerabilities, provenance, malware, integrity, authenticity, etc. And then how you machine read and scale this is through various integrations. So this information can be interfacing with enterprise risk management systems, GRC tools, network tools like SOC SIM tools, asset management. It has to probably tie back to vendor management. And then if you have application development as an end user or in an OEM environment, this interfaces with DevOps environments as well. So for the SBOMs, a little bit of information about FACS, and I don't think, again, I have to classically explain here what FACS is, but basically it tells... Yes.
Okay, can I ask you also to start making it a little bit more interactive? On the previous slides, what would you say that you see as a time frame for this to be happening? I mean, the way that you presented here, are we talking 2026, 2027, or what do you think is feasible for this to happen, or do you see it already happening now in energy or in other domains?
Yeah, I think starting now, at least, and this is just one company, but on the Fortress side, this is imminent now that we have a repository solution already for vendor risk management information. And the SBOMs are basically going to enhance that supply chain risk information set. And we will enable SBOM sharing through a repository, as we already do for vendor risk management. And then with the federal timeline, again, even though a repository in the OMB memo is kind of timelined for in the next 2-3 years, how are you going to operationalize attestations that you need to start asking for as soon as June of next year? You will not be able to scale this effectively, likely without a repository. So I think that as soon as the requests for information start to come out, and we see those coming out imminently, then you need to have something in place to operationalize the sharing, and therefore I think the repository is going to be needed right away. And in relation to this, can you give us some examples on for instance, some of the cases that you're working on? How many SBOMs we're talking about here that they try to manage in terms of sheer volume? Yeah, that will be ultimately for millions of assets. So we focused on building out an open source on the Fortress side, first building out an open source library. So there we focus on the most popular projects in GitHub, and then having SBOMs translated in the different developer languages or for the different developer languages. So that's in the thousands of SBOMs and thousands of projects. And then for commercial proprietary software, that depends a little bit on the definition of critical and maybe how that ties back to existing definitions, such as in the US for the BES, the Built Power System. For an average large investor-owned utility, that will be a few million assets. And then, yeah, we'll probably have to rely partially on data-driven or reverse engineering approaches to get some skill. But then it's also the vendor community who knows that that's limited in terms of its accuracy. So hopefully that provides incentive for them to start collaborating on providing SBOM information.
How do you see basically the vendor community relating to this? Because we do see quite a lot of resistance here in Europe on this. I mean, it's of course it's a different landscape in the sense that there's not really a requirement like in the US, but for at least for some vendors from Europe who are trying to sell into the US, it becomes much more of an issue. One of the reasons why we're sitting here, of course. But how do you see the vendors reacting to this? Especially, do they feel the need that they need to step up on this?
Yeah, I think like Josh Corman actually was the person who initially coined SBOM as an acronym. We had him speak recently at one of our client events, and he mentioned it's going to be a collective going through stages of grief. And maybe some of us are still in denial. And
sounds like Josh.
Yes, yeah, I feel personally a lot of it has to do also with setting expectations around this information sharing and making it not very punitive or scary from the get-go. So I do think the requests for this information are coming out imminently. Does that mean, for example, that DICE shall now patch any and all vulnerabilities, whereas that's not even feasible or doesn't make any sense to do so? So in terms of the expectation set as to what then would be action based on having that information, I think there's some collaborative spirit or some opportunity to be reasonable and to also understand that from one day to the next, to get information that is actually actionable, it will take a little bit. A lot of OEMs will have gaps, like they will not have all of their third-party components and open source insights to the level that they need to have SBOM information like they have for their in-house developed code. And there's a level of anxiety, of course, but when that information gets out, especially when there's unknowns or if there's a whole host of vulnerabilities for which there's no neatly facts style, this can't be exploited explanation available, like what will happen if that gets out. So probably in terms of the expectation set around information sharing, Josh mentioned an example of working with a financial services provider where there were grace periods. Initially, the only thing that the financial institution was going to be doing with this information was basically sit on it, and for an incident response use case, just use it to inventory their asset base, versus being very proactive with vulnerability management. So he mentioned that as an example where year one, it was like, let's ask for this information, and if you don't give it to us, nothing necessarily will happen, but down the line there will be something happening. Year two, we'll be prioritizing this with vulnerability management. Year three, we're going to ask for massive discounts if you can't provide this information, or like there's some procurement consequence if you don't provide this information. So maybe providing a timeline with expectations as to what may happen with the information being shared, that could help, I think, creating some trust.
Okay, gotcha. Thank you.
So the VAX information is going to be extremely important to focus supply chain efforts on that what matters, and it sits kind of it sits alongside security advisories, yeah, very important to get rid of false positives. Advising the opposite way, of course, than a security advisory, like you don't have to pay attention to the following, versus security advisories highlighting what you should absolutely pay attention to. In a process, so maybe tied to the repository as well, this is how the flow could look like, from identifying what software you need SBOMs on, gathering them, validating them, analyzing them for risk, and then managing risks, including through automation or workflow automation. Just an example of an end-to-end process for SBOM and VAX information. And back to the original slide where you saw organizational system and component level risk, ultimately context is going to remain king. So to just know risks associated with a component doesn't necessarily give you a overall external parameter and how it ties to your internal parameter risk understanding. And beyond vulnerability information, there has to be other ways to prioritize what matters, including looking at TTPs and threat landscape information, and also leveraging security control. So ideally, based on the product the component sits in, you have some SDL and secure by design controls information that you can leverage to further prioritize why a vulnerability or why an issue with the component matters or shouldn't matter. A lot of emphasis on machine readable information. We've seen Bob Martin with his System of Trust talks this year. And his SCIT proposal. And there's also a project by NIST, OPSCAL, OPSCAL, translating like PDF standards and standard documents into machine readable security controls. So ultimately, if all of this information were to be available in JSON format from MITRE ATT&CK to standard controls that are machine readable, you have the asset inventory and you have the machine readable vulnerability information that allows for a lot of automation through repository solutions to combine all of those different data inputs and correlate as part of analysis with some meaningful insights that is also actionable. And really the prerequisite here is that this information should be machine readable. So some takeaways for the SBOM. Data accuracy matters, so garbage in, garbage out. If you can't get accurate data, it's going to probably confuse the heck out of everyone, more so than not having any information at all. So it's really important that you get that collaborative approach to generating SBOMs, as we already know the limitations, at least based on current tooling for just getting the information through reverse engineering. Context matters. So I mentioned that ties to kind of generalized supply chain risk management, and also taking into account product security controls and threat landscape. You should probably focus on active threat actors and what their most common TTPs are versus looking at vulnerabilities without that context. For operationalizing SBOMs, a lot will come down to, yes, can you generate SBOMs? Are vendors able to generate SBOMs? But ultimately, this goes back to overall foundations, because if you can't put the SBOMs into any other context, if you don't have an asset management program, a lot of it will go flat. Like I was at an oil and gas conference this week, and based here in the US on the TSA pipeline directive, there's a lot more emphasis on vulnerability management across IT and OT assets. So for example, if you don't have your asset vulnerability management intact or in place for your OT assets, how will you actually tie the SBOM insight to doing something vulnerability management wise on your OT assets? It becomes a lot more difficult. For expectation setting, how to actually operationalize also contractual language or requirements language, asking specific questions, setting specific expectations. All of that is foundational to being able to do something with SBOMs at all. And then workflow automation and process excellence is going to be important to do any information sharing and analysis at scale, including collaboratively as a supply chain team. So those would be my takeaways for IoT development. But then again, I've been heavily speaking from a supply chain risk management perspective, ultimately how that good development effort should be leveraged in supply chain risk management. With that, are there any other questions?
I'm looking around here. No, I see some nodding faces and some people swallowing a little bit the information and the level of detail, and also understanding what's coming next to us. Do you see any relations with the EU on this from your side? The EU is taking, of course, different routes with the both the Cybersecurity Act and also the Cyber Resilience Act. The latter one being, of course, very much into the space. Is there something that you can see from your side on this?
Yeah, I'm kind of interested to get maybe feedback from the room. I will have a meeting with the European Commission at 9 a.m. my morning, or so your 3 p.m. Today. Okay. But basically, yeah, the Cyber Resilience Act, in as far like I traversed through the Netherlands and Brussels over the last few weeks, and did note a whole lot of discussion or piqued a lot of people's interest as to what this new proposed act is going to do. And I think the approach is very different and interesting, and maybe more reflecting of other countries' approaches, like where Singapore may be heading, for example, is to really put the emphasis on, well, first of all, regulation, of course, different from an executive order and then federal procurement guidance. And second, this focus on embedding it in product security and market access, versus not doing that at all in the US. So we'll be curious to for leveraging procurement as the main driver versus working with manufacturers to stipulate this is now part of getting your products to market. Any thoughts you may have on how fast would that move? Getting products certified, of course, is always it's never going to be a 1 month, 2 months implementation timeline for like to get products certified. There's I have been at UL long enough. It takes a while to get that coverage in terms of certifications. So yeah, I'm kind of happy actually to hear from you if you see any benefits or what is your take? Would this move more effectively than a procurement approach in the US or the other way around?
Again, some people are wondering a little bit. I'd say the two approaches are to some extent very complementary. Also, the way that you now put them. It's the typical European approach, of course, of being much more general and putting out regulatory frameworks, whereas this is very much more practical. But from the certification framework, as I told also the people in the room earlier today, we've been seeing the developments of this for the last 5-6 years, and still waiting the first one to really pop up. Apart from the one in 5G, if you like. So that's still definitely going to take quite a lot of time before it actually happens. However, people from within the Commission and also from ENISA are considering that probably by 2024 there will be the first ones popping up, specifically in critical infrastructure. Let's say the ones with the high impact. So that on the one hand side. My aim, at least, would be in order to not duplicate or reduplicate different efforts, is that at least they would consider the use of SBOMs in the domain where they would see a concrete implementation of the regulatory framework, and where then this mechanism can basically serve as a means to also provide attestation and proof on how well it has been set, and that's at least the way that we try to convey it into the Commission and also to ETSI, for instance. But I would love to hear what they tell to you. So let's definitely keep in touch on that.
Yeah, and I think ultimately for the global vendor / manufacturing / industry community, some interoperability between the US. Like if there were to be some alignment as to what an attestation looks like, or some alignment on these artifacts and also means for sharing, for example, that would be tremendously helpful, of course.
Yeah, later on this afternoon, as you've seen, we will be talking also to Schneider Electric, to Cassie, because there we definitely also want to learn a bit on the relation of using SBOMs to actually get the certification right. And I think the certification, for instance, on 62443 and -1 and -2, but also on the new one, the ISO 27400, when it comes to device security. I think probably also the SBOMs can be used. At least that's the way that I've seen it evolving. Not sure what your experience there is, but that's something that might be useful, and that then also is being considered by the Commission as a means to provide the proof.
Yeah, no, Cassie will have a lot of great things to say there. She also had some good content or earlier blogs on well, there is a level of maturity also as part of building software builds and other tooling to manage SBOMs, generate SBOMs, and indeed as evidenced or as required for 62443 FortressInformationSecurity certification, for example. And then that should be leveraged, or there has to be a translation to procurement mandates and supply chain risk management. And maybe the supply chain risk management context, that's not what she said, but that's what I'm thinking now, will then maybe again inform what does good look like for SDL certification and what you do as part of your software build process. Some of the attestation guidance in the procurement landscape can maybe inform again what you should be paying attention to as part of your SDL. So I think where I heard her come from a few times is that the SDL side of the equation and the SCRM side of the equation, there's a shift left, shift right. There is going to be influence on both from both directions, but ultimately they need to be in sync. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thanks, Janneke, for sharing your insights. I think overall we're very much aligned in this, and it would definitely be good in keeping each other up to date on the two sides. Okay, Netherlands, as you wish.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I know you had a hard stop as well, so I think we need to let you go. But definitely the next time that you're around, passing through Brussels, the Netherlands, give us a heads up, and then hopefully we can see you also live at some point in time.
Definitely, yeah. I remain a fairly lousy expat, so I'm back in Europe all the time. So I will definitely let you know next time around, and we can then meet up face to face.
Super. Thank you. Gronda, have a nice day.